A sharp, icy sound sliced through the air. A sudden rip. The boarding pass was snatched from her hand, then torn cleanly in two. Alicia Grant froze, not out of fear, but at the sheer brazenness of the act. Mark Ellison stood before her, his hand still trembling slightly from the anger he was trying and failing to conceal. His eyes narrowed, as though Alicia, a black woman in a muted grey blazer, had just trespassed into some sacred territory he believed he owned. "You do not belong there." His voice was cold, hollow, territorial. The camera of the imagination panned slowly the entire business-class cabin, holding its breath. Passengers looked up. No one spoke. No one intervened. The silence thickened into a glass wall, dividing those who supposedly belonged from those who were never meant to. Alicia watched the fragments of paper fall to the floor. It was not just a boarding pass. It was a declaration, a poisonous reminder that she did not belong on that level of society. But Mark had just made a mistake, one with consequences sharp enough to detonate beneath his own career. 2 minutes before, the paper was torn, Alicia Grant had stepped onto the aircraft with the calm composure of someone who had learned to stay silent amid chaos. She didn't rush. She made no unnecessary sound. Even her footsteps carried a precision shaped by 2 decades of making decisions that safeguarded millions of lives. She didn't need to project power. She was power. The business-class seat 17 Alpha still sat in her phone, the digital evidence that the place belonged to her by every character in the system. But for Mark Ellison, truth mattered less than the prejudice etched into his gaze from the first second. He looked at Alicia not as a customer, but as a gatekeeper guarding a private club reserved for a select kind of person. Alicia had seen that look thousands of times in her life, a look that defined her before she spoke, a look that gave itself permission to decide who was worthy and who was not. She stood tall, not timid, not pleading. "That seat is mine." Mark let out a mocking laugh, slow and cold, stretched deliberately to emphasize the class divide he believed he controlled. "I will decide where you sit." The air in the cabin shifted. A subtle current of unease ran through every row, settling into the ears of passengers, pretending to be busy while listening intently. The man in the seat ahead, Harold Foster 62, pressed his mouth into a thin line. His wife, Linda, 60 years old, turned back to cast Alicia a familiar look one Alicia had recognized since childhood, the look of someone convinced they possessed an invisible privilege that placed them above others. Alicia's body reacted by instinct, shoulders tightening, breath pressing into her chest, not from fear but from memory echoes of similar scenes etched into her career. But this time was different. This time she was not the young engineer being dismissed in a meeting, not the investigator belittled at an accident site, not the black woman pressured into silence before an all-male board. This time, Alicia Grant was someone no one had the right to underestimate, even if they did not yet know it. Mark tightened his grip on the boarding pass. "Get out of this seat." His voice shed its customer service disguise, turning threatening and insulting. Alicia kept her tone steady to an unnerving degree. "You do not have the authority to tear my ticket." "And you do not have the right to sit here," Mark replied, each word driven like a nail. "This is business class. It is for customers with the appropriate profile." Alicia knew exactly what he meant. No explanation needed. She met his gaze with such direct intensity that Mark faltered for half a second, as though sensing something wrong. But a man like Mark Ellison did not back down, especially not before someone he assumed was beneath him. He gestured sharply. "Follow me." Alicia did not move. "You will have to explain the reason." Mark scoffed. "The reason is that I said so." It was the opening shot of a battle he did not realize he had just initiated with a commander far above his rank, someone whose single signature could force half the aviation industry to audit its procedures. But Mark saw only a black woman in a grey blazer. Not the title, not the authority, not the force standing behind her, only the color of her skin. And that choice sealed his fate. Alicia walked after Mark down the aisle. The imagined camera shifts to a low angle following her steps. Cabin lights illuminated her face, calm yet cold. No anger, no pleading, only absolute control. Mark strode ahead, glancing back repeatedly to ensure she obeyed. He wanted her to feel small. He wanted her to know he held the power. He had no idea he was walking himself directly into the largest federal investigation of his career. They walked past premium, past economy, plus into economy. Still farther, beyond the exit row, past the lavatory, to the very back of the aircraft. Row 41, a middle seat, cramped, no window, no recline. Mark pointed at seat 41, echo. "Here, sit." Alicia examined the seat for one brief moment. "You are violating federal passenger regulations," she said, her voice low, but as sharp as a blade. Mark smirked. "Deal with it. You should know your place." A sentence that crossed the final threshold between discrimination and cruelty. The cabin air thickened. Michael Turner, the man across the aisle, shot to his feet. "He is wrong." Ruby Allen shook her head, eyes bright with furious disbelief. Evelyn Park raised her phone and began recording. But Mark didn't care. He believed cabin authority was absolute. He believed no one could reverse his command. Yet he had just driven Alicia into the one position most dangerous for him, the position in which she now had full justification to act. Alicia sat in seat 41 echo. No defiance, no fighting, only one quiet sentence, heavy enough to carry an entire federal agency behind it. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." The camera zooms slowly into Alicia's eyes. No rage, no fear, only the cold certainty of someone who already knows she will end this story on her terms. From that moment, the cabin was no longer a cabin. It was a battlefield, a confrontation between prejudice and truth, between counterfeit authority and real authority. And Mark Ellison. He still had no idea who he had provoked. He had only seen the woman he assumed was powerless. He had not yet seen the director of the Federal Aviation Administration. He had not yet seen the end of his career. But it was coming step by inevitable step, because justice once challenged always finds its way back, even at 35,000 feet. Alicia settled into seat 41, echo her breath tightening in her chest, not from fear, but from the raw metallic sting of humiliation spreading through the air. She placed her leather briefcase on her lap, fingers tightening around the handle to steady herself, while the sharp, abrupt sound from up front signaled that Mark Ellison was still walking away, with the cold satisfaction of someone who believed he had just taught someone a lesson about order. The cabin behind him stirred with murmurs, outrage and confusion, twisting together like a compressed current trapped inside the sealed aircraft. Michael Turner leaned toward Alicia, his voice low and tense, saying he had witnessed everything. Ruby Allen rested her wrinkled hand on the armrest, her eyes filled with a lifetime's worth of disappointment and simmering anger. Evelyn Park's hands trembled slightly as she held up her phone, but her gaze steadied the moment it met Alicia's. Alicia understood what was happening more clearly than anyone. This was not about a seat. This was an equation of power prejudice and the erosion of dignity that unfolded day after day in places people assumed were civilized and orderly. She opened her laptop. The screen glowed, reflecting the calm, icy focus on her face. She typed deliberately. Time, words spoken, witnesses, the language of someone who understood the system, the language of someone who knew that a precise report could force an entire airline to pay a heavy price. Mark Ellison glanced back from the front, catching sight of the screen's glow, and the corner of his mouth twitched. Annoyance mixed with something else, a flicker of unease. He could not comprehend why the woman he had pushed to the bottom now sat upright, unbroken, unshrinking, unafraid. Men like Mark were accustomed to seeing fear. They were not accustomed to seeing silence filled with authority. Alicia did not look up, though she felt his stare clearly. She kept typing, her movements sharp, and controlled the practiced precision of someone who had wielded language as a weapon for years. Every keystroke pierced the thin shell of counterfeit authority Mark believed he possessed. The engine hum began to rise, but the tension among the passengers overshadowed even the machinery. Evelyn leaned closer, whispering that she was recording everything and would send the footage to Alicia if needed. Michael said he would testify. Ruby nodded slowly but firmly, as if delivering a moral verdict that had been waiting for the right moment. Alicia closed the laptop. Not a single wasted sound. She knew this flight would not end quietly. What Mark had done would not simply fade when the aircraft lifted off the runway. He thought he had buried her in the last row to make her small, to trap her in a dark corner where no one cared. But dark corners were where truth tended to ignite. She adjusted her posture, sitting even straighter, eyes fixed ahead, as though she were seeing through layers of metal and fabric and light straight to the point where the real confrontation would begin. No trembling, no hesitation, no fatigue. Inside Alicia, a pressure was building, a force, gathering strength and certainty, waiting for the right moment to surge back toward the man who believed he held all the authority. This battle had only just begun, and she, despite sitting in the lowest row, was the only person who understood she now occupied the highest ground on the power map that Mark Ellison was too blind to see. Mark Ellison returned to the rear cabin with footsteps heavy enough to feel like a warning. He said nothing, but his presence alone made some passengers fall silent, while others avoided his gaze as if it were a toxic source of heat. He stared at Michael first, then swept his eyes to Ruby, and finally stopped at Evelyn with her phone in hand. The look was not an open threat, but the quiet intimidation of a man who believed cabin authority was absolute, who believed that one frown from him would make everyone shrink back. But Alicia didn't shrink. She looked up at him, her eyes holding no fear, no challenge, no permission, only a steady presence that forced others to confront themselves. Mark leaned in his voice, low and edged. I do not want to see anyone recording. This is my plane. I decide what is allowed to happen. One sentence shattered inside Alicia's mind, not because it hurt, but because it revealed something even clearer than the insult. He treated the aircraft like his personal territory, a place where laws, regulations, or the dignity of passengers existed only if he allowed them to. Evelyn pulled her phone closer on instinct, but Alicia placed a gentle hand on her arm, just a light touch, but enough to warn her not to be afraid. Michael shifted, ready to stand if things escalated. Ruby took a deep breath, as though holding back tears from witnessing a scene painfully familiar across too many generations. Alicia turned slightly in her seat, leaning back, her voice low, yet so clear that Mark involuntarily stepped half a pace away. You do not have the authority to stop passengers from recording discriminatory behavior. Mark narrowed his eyes. You do not want to test what authority I have. You do not understand, Alicia replied, her gaze sharp as a laser cut. But you will. A silence stretched tense and thin as a string about to snap. Mark turned to Evelyn, grabbed her wrist and jerked it sharply. Give me that phone. No filming on the plane. Evelyn yanked back instinctively. You do not have the right. Mark tightened his grip around her wrist, squeezing hard. Her breath caught her hand, trembling. Across the cabin seats, scraped as passengers stood. A wave of anger surged through the space as everyone suddenly realized Mark was not just discriminating. He was now abusing his authority right in front of them. Michael rose to his full height, his voice blazing. Let her go! Ruby stood too, her shoulders shaking with outrage. Good heavens, what are you doing? Several passengers began filming openly. No hiding. No fear. Mark released Evelyn, his face shifting from red to a bruised purple in fury. He was not used to resistance. He was not used to being seen as a bully. The collapse of his ego showed in every line of his expression. Alicia stood. Not quickly. Not aggressively. Just stood, and the cabin fell silent, as if someone had shut off the sound. She was not tall. She did not shout. She did not posture like a hero. But when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of an institution Mark had never dared to challenge. Give her phones back. Right now. Mark let out a mocking laugh, but it cracked in the air when Alicia stepped half a pace closer and looked directly at him. Her eyes did not burn with anger. They held only one thing, the authority he could not recognize. You have just violated multiple federal provisions, Alicia said, each word hammered into place. I am advising you to stop all obstructive, violent and discriminatory behavior immediately. Mark's throat constricted. His face twisted with a confusion he could not name. Half of him wanted to explode. The other half was beginning to feel something else, the first tremor of fear. Not fear of Alicia. Fear of whatever stood behind her. Something he could not yet see, but could sense, rising like a vast shadow beneath the surface. Alicia sat back down without another word. But the shift in the cabin was seismic. Mark no longer stood at the center. Every gaze had turned toward Alicia. She had not claimed authority, but real authority never needed to be claimed. It announced itself. Mark stepped back once, then twice. He turned away, intending to retreat to the front. But before he could move, Alicia spoke again, her voice soft enough that Evelyn had to tilt her head to hear. You are being recorded, both your actions and your words, and you will answer to federal law. Mark froze mid-step. A bead of sweat slid from his temple down his neck. For the first time that morning, Alicia saw the truth. He had no idea what was unfolding, and that ignorance would be the beginning of his downfall. The plane had not yet left the ground, but the confrontation was already underway, and the cabin, though noisy, sensed something undeniable. Mark Ellison had crossed a line no one could save him from. No one except the very woman he believed was the weakest person on the plane. The only person on board with the power to turn his actions into a federal case. Alicia rose from seat 41, echo the moment the seatbelt sign switched off, and no one stopped her. No one dared. The cabin vibrated lightly as passengers began to move, but nothing was louder than the taut silence stretched like steel wire between her and Mark Ellison. She stepped into the aisle with the calm of someone merely checking her handbag, yet beneath that quiet exterior was the slow rotation of a storm that had been held in silence for far too long. She walked straight toward the lavatory at the back of the aircraft. The cold yellow light spilled unevenly across her face as the door opened. The narrow space smelled of harsh disinfectant, the engine's hum pulsing through the metal frame. But Alicia let none of it penetrate the concentration, drawn tight as a bowstring inside her chest. She adjusted her blazer collar, washed her hands, then opened the door and stepped out. And then she saw it. A beverage cart positioned sideways in the aisle, abandoned there, blocking the emergency exit route, like a boulder wedged into the mouth of a cave. Alicia stopped for less than a fraction of a second, but in that fraction, her eyes shifted. States from ordinary to alert, from alert to analytical, from analytical to conclusive. A violation? Severe? Indefensible? She pulled out her phone. One photo, one mental caption, aisle obstruction aft section, documented. Then she looked deeper. Row 36, the emergency exit door, its handle covered by a large roller bag shoved carelessly into the corner, blocking even the instructional placard. She took another photo. Each image was a steel-tipped bullet aimed directly at Mark's weakest point, his legal accountability. Alicia walked down the aisle. Each step was a safety assessment. Each glance, a miniature inspection report. She opened an overhead bin. Inside, where there should have been 5 standard life vests, there were only 3. 2 missing. No report, no tag, no notation. Another photo. Another mark in the dossier she was writing silently in her mind. Along the floor lighting system, the emergency aisle lights at row 36 flickered, then went dark. One missed heartbeat. One moment that in an actual emergency could cost lives. Alicia tightened her grip on the phone. She felt it clearly, the truth unfolding around her. Not a small oversight. Not a temporary glitch. This was evidence of something far deeper. A mixture of negligence, concealment, and unchecked authority, all of which Mark Ellison embodied perfectly. She lowered the phone with the same calm someone might have while checking email, but her mind was mapping the battle ahead. A battle she had no desire to start, but one Mark had dragged her into with his own reckless arrogance. Alicia paused when she heard a soft voice from the mid-cabin. Melissa Hart. Trembling, holding back tears, Alicia's body shifted instinctively into emergency mode the moment she recognized what was happening behind the galley curtain. She moved closer without a sound, like a camera slipping behind the scenes of a coercive confrontation. Mark's voice cut through the space, quiet but venomous. "You think you are better than me?" I said, "Serve the people I tell you to serve." And 38 Echo is not one of them. "Do you understand?" Melissa tried to reply, but her voice cracked. I was just following the safety procedure. And I noticed missing life vests. I reported it to you last week, and I told you it is not important. Keep your mouth shut and do your job. Do not side with that type of person. That phrase, that type of person, sliced through the air like a dull but poisonous blade. Alicia stepped forward into the light. No more hiding. No more distance. Is there a problem here? Mark jolted his face, draining from red to white in a heartbeat. He tried to rebuild his facade of authority, but Alicia's gaze cut through it like a blade through paper. "This is crew-only space." "You're not allowed back here," Mark said, though his voice quivered. Alicia did not answer immediately. Her eyes drifted down to the cart blocking the aisle, then to the obstructed emergency exit, then to the darkened escape lights. Finally, her gaze returned to Mark. No anger, No raised voice, just a silent judgment that made the man before her shrink inward. "I will be reporting these safety violations," Alicia said, her voice low, sharp, and compressed like cockpit pressure. "And I need to speak to the captain right now." Mark laughed, a brittle, broken sound like metal bending under strain. "Do you even know who you are talking to? I am the person responsible for this cabin. You know nothing about regulations." The galley went dead silent. Melissa lowered her head, gripping the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. Alicia did not move, did not retreat. Her voice sliced the air clean in two. "Mark Ellison, you are in violation of multiple federal aviation regulations. I advise you to think very carefully before denying responsibility again." The silence that followed lasted only 3 seconds. But in those 3 seconds, Mark understood this was not an ordinary passenger. Not someone who would fear threats. Not someone who could be shoved into a corner without consequence. Alicia placed her hand on her phone, not to call for help, but to initiate exactly what she had prepared for since the moment he tore up her boarding pass. "Call the captain. Immediately." Mark opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out, because in Alicia's eyes for the first time, he saw the power he had unknowingly summoned onto his own head. His downfall had already begun, and he did not even know who Alicia Grant was. Daniel Brooks appeared in the aisle like a clean, decisive cut between chaos and order. The white cabin lights reflected off the pilot epaulets on his shoulders, sharpening the stern lines of his face. He did not need many questions. One look at Melissa's reddened eyes, the abandoned cart blocking the aisle, and Mark standing squared off against Alicia, like a man on the edge of losing control, was enough for him to know this was far beyond a difficult passenger. Alicia turned toward Daniel. Her gaze was calm, yet beneath that calm burned a fire too clear to overlook. Daniel asked, in a professional, clipped tone. "What happened here?" Alicia answered concisely, every fragment of information compressed like an incident report. The blocked aisle, the obstructed emergency exit, the missing life vests, the failed emergency lighting. She recited the corresponding regulatory clauses with such precision that Daniel instinctively glanced at Mark as if to say, "You did not tell me the full story." Mark cut in his voice, strained with anger. She was wandering around, opening bins, disturbing passengers. She is causing trouble. Alicia turned her head, not raising her voice, yet her interruption silenced him instantly. "I documented violations. I did not cause trouble. I did the job you should have done." Daniel drew a slow breath, trying to maintain professional cadence. "I need to verify what you reported." Alicia nodded and led him through the cabin to each location. Every place they stopped, every piece of evidence, Daniel touched every gap he saw with his own eyes, snapped one more thread in the already fragile rope of trust between him and Mark. When Daniel opened the overhead bin himself and counted the missing life vests, his expression changed entirely. No doubt left, only concern and responsibility. Mark explained this. Mark replied like someone rushing through a terrible draft. "Missing some equipment, it is not serious. And besides, not serious." Daniel spun around. "This is mandatory equipment. This is life-critical." Impatience carved through his voice. This was no internal disagreement. This was a safety risk laid bare in front of him. Daniel turned to Alicia, his tone less sharp but weighted with respect. "Do you have photographic evidence?" Alicia unlocked her phone. Clear images appeared crisp as investigative documents, each position, each failure, each violation captured without ambiguity. Daniel looked at them, and in his eyes, Alicia finally saw what she had been waiting for, the seriousness of someone who understood the true magnitude. She still had not stated her identity. She did not need to. The precision of her documentation said it for her. "We need to report this to the captain," Daniel said. "Immediately." Mark burst out. "No, the captain is busy. This does not need her." "I can." Alicia turned toward him. One cutting look extinguished the rest of his sentence. "You lost your authority the moment you dismissed passenger safety." Daniel did not hesitate another second. He picked up the interphone and called directly to the cockpit. No one stopped him. No one dared. In the cabin, the air seemed to freeze. Every whisper, every rustle of paper, every seatbelt click faded into the background. The entire aircraft felt like it was holding its breath, sensing this had moved far beyond petty conflict. It was becoming something larger, deeper, and far more serious. The interphone clicked off. Daniel said, "She will be out right away." Mark blinked rapidly, as if trying to understand how the situation he believed he controlled completely, had slipped from his grip and tumbled into a steep downfall. He turned to Alicia, voice hoarse. "Who are you that you think you can?" But he never finished the sentence. The cockpit door opened, and Captain Sarah Coleman stepped out. Her posture was decisive, her eyes sharp as landing lights in a storm. When she looked down, the cabin, every sound fell silent. Alicia stood straight, not arrogant, not triumphant, simply present like a pillar others unconsciously leaned toward. Sarah looked at Alicia, first then at Mark, then at the cart blocking the aisle, the bag covering the emergency exit, and Melissa trying to wipe her tears. It only took a simple equation for the captain to understand everything. "What is going on here?" Sarah asked, her voice not loud, but carrying enough gravity to settle the entire cabin. Alicia spoke her tone so calm that Mark swallowed hard. "I documented multiple federal level safety violations. I asked for an explanation, but was denied." Sarah turned her gaze to Mark without blinking. "Do you confirm these claims?" Mark opened his mouth, but no words came out. Sarah looked back to Alicia. "May I see your evidence?" Alicia handed her the phone. The screen lit her face as she scrolled through each image. With every swipe, her expression grew more severe. When she finished, she exhaled a long, heavy breath. "We will address this immediately. Thank you for reporting it." Alicia nodded. She did not bow. She did not apologize. She did not retreat. And in that moment, the cabin understood, even without knowing who she was, that Alicia Grant was not someone relegated to the back of the aircraft. She was the one pulling the truth into the light, and when the light became bright enough, it would burn down the career of the man who had treated her as if she belonged at the bottom of society. Sarah led Alicia back toward the mid-cabin to continue the inspection, but this time no one dared whisper. The air felt dense, as if the aircraft had just undergone a pressure shift. Passengers who had witnessed the earlier events rose halfway from their seats, leaning forward to see clearly. Those who had not heard anything yet exchanged quick glances, instantly understanding that something serious was unfolding, something far beyond an angry flight attendant. This was a system being exposed. Sarah opened the overhead bin at row 35, only 3 life vests. She did not need Alicia to say another word. The captain counted again, then once more, as if hoping the missing numbers would reappear if she slowed down. They did not. They sat there stark and undeniable like cracks running through a concrete wall. Sarah turned toward Mark, and in her eyes was something far more dangerous than anger. The disappointment of someone who could not forgive a mistake repeated more than once. "When did you perform your pre-flight check?" Mark swallowed. 6:30 in the morning. Everything was full. Then why are 2 vests missing? Maybe passengers moved things around. Passengers do not relocate life vests. And even if they did, you are required to notice. Sarah's voice was not loud, yet everyone heard it. It carried the weight of someone signing a suspension notice in front of an entire crew, calm but so heavy that every other sound lost its place. Alicia sat on a nearby jump seat so Melissa could step forward, though the young woman hesitated. Melissa's hands trembled slightly, fingers intertwined as if trying to comfort herself. Sarah looked at her. "Melissa, have you noticed anything unusual during recent shifts?" Melissa hesitated for half a second. Then she glanced at Alicia. Something about Alicia's presence anchored her, countering the fear pulling at her chest. Melissa exhaled deeply, as if unfastening an invisible lock. "Yes, I told Mark last week that the lifer vests were missing, and that the lights at row 36 were flickering. But he said it was fine." Sarah turned to Mark immediately, her stare sharp enough to cut metal. "Did she report these issues to you?" Mark's body stiffened. The cabin grew so silent, the faint clink of someone's cup could be heard. "I do not recall," Mark said, his voice showing cracks. "Then let me help you remember, because if she reported it, and you still signed off a complete pre-flight, this is no longer an oversight. This is a federal violation." Several passengers inhaled sharply. Someone in row 14 whispered, "My goodness." Alicia stood, not interrupting, not trying to take over. She simply stood as the final witness needed when truth rose from the shadows. She was not a safety trainer yet. The way she examined the cabin made passengers imagine she understood this aircraft better than those who flew it. Daniel returned with the logbook in hand. He opened it in front of Sarah. There are torn pages. 2 days without detailed inspection notes. Maintenance report from this morning is missing sections. Sarah clenched her jaw. Not with rage, but with the silent fury of someone who cannot tolerate threats to safety on the aircraft she commands. "Mark, these are critical documents. Why are they missing?" Mark's knees wavered. I do not know. Maybe the tech crew misplaced. The pages were torn." "Not misplaced." Daniel's voice landed like a judge's gavel. Passengers murmured. Melissa covered her mouth. Sarah turned back to Alicia. "I need your assessment." "Would this qualify as a serious violation based on what you have recorded?" Alicia answered without hesitation. "Yes." "And beyond that? Negligence, concealment, and ignoring internal reports elevate the violation to federal severity." Sarah looked into Alicia's eyes as though searching for something. Not confirmation, but authority. She sensed something much larger standing before her, even though Alicia had not yet stated her identity. The way she spoke, the way she evaluated, the way she cited regulations as if she had written them. No ordinary passenger carried this level of knowledge or this level of certainty. "Do you work in aviation?" Sarah asked. "For a long time," Alicia replied steadily. In what capacity? Alicia met her gaze, neither lying nor revealing everything. Regulatory oversight. Daniel blinked. Sarah tilted her head slightly. Mark stepped back, almost involuntarily. Those 4 words, regulatory oversight, carried a weight heavier than a formal job title. They meant she had the authority to investigate, to demand inquiry, and even to recommend suspension of operations if necessary. Alicia did not need to explain. They understood. Sarah inhaled. "Thank you. I will take action immediately." She turned to Daniel. "Notify the ground service chief upon landing. Request legal support ahead of arrival." Then she faced Mark directly. "From now until the end of this flight, you are relieved of all cabin duties. Do not interact with passengers. Do not communicate with any crew member. You will remain in the aft galley, and you will not leave that area." Mark's face drained. His mouth opened, but failed to produce sound, like someone trying to breathe under pressure they could not comprehend. Sarah did not wait for his response. The decision had been made, and the entire cabin had just witnessed the moment the power structure inverted completely. Alicia stood still quiet, but far from invisible. Passengers looked at her, as if seeing a new portrait take shape, a woman not pushed to the last row, but someone capable of pulling the entire truth to the front. And in that moment, they sensed this was only the visible part, because they still did not know who she truly was. But they would. Very soon. Sarah left the cabin, but the weight of her authority remained suspended in the air like a live electrical wire that no one dared to touch. Mark disappeared behind the galley curtain, yet the fear, confusion, and shadow he left behind continued to chill the cabin in a way words could not fully capture. People tried to sit still, but their eyes told the truth. Every gaze drifted toward Alicia. Alicia returned to seat 17 Alpha at Sarah's request. Each step she took through the cabin felt like a reset of the entire power structure. No one spoke, yet every head turned slightly as she passed, a quiet wave of awe, curiosity, and unspoken regret from those who wished they had spoken up earlier. Harold and Linda Foster sat rigid like carved statues, staring out the window, as if that could shield them from the truth closing in on all sides. Alicia placed her briefcase into the overhead bin and closed it neatly. She sat, adjusted her belt. A simple gesture, yet heavier than any accusation. Everyone could feel it. She was not returning to her seat because something rightful had been restored. She returned because the cabin's order had been redefined, and the mark of that shift rested in her posture alone. Melissa approached with a tray of hot towels, standing, slightly tilted, both hands gripping the tray. I am sorry for what happened," she whispered, her voice trembling with sincerity. Alicia accepted the towel with a small nod. "It is not your fault." Melissa bit her lip, fear flickering in her eyes, fear of consequences she could not predict. Alicia met her gaze for just 1 second, but that second was enough for Melissa to understand that telling the truth had not only protected the passengers, it had protected herself. A sudden noise erupted from the back, a harsh sweep of the curtain, a low growl. Then Mark's voice, no longer controlled, exploded across the cabin. "I do not care. This cabin is mine. You people do not understand how long I have worked here." Passengers flinched. Melissa paled. Daniel immediately stood from the forward section and moved quickly toward the rear. "Mark!" he shouted for the first time, losing all of his composed demeanor. "You are defying a direct order from the captain. Get back into the galley. This is your final warning." Mark barked from behind the curtain. "She does not belong in business class." "I was just—" Daniel yanked the curtain aside. Mark stood there, face flushed red from fury and humiliation, his hand gripping the counter so tightly his knuckles turned white. "If you open your mouth one more time," Daniel said, voice low and dangerous, "I will request airport security upon landing, and you will leave this aircraft in a way no one wants." The cabin went dead silent. Mark looked around desperately for support, but found only fear and contempt in the eyes staring back at him. No allies, no excuses, nowhere left to stand. He stepped back, hit the galley wall, then disappeared behind the curtain. This time he truly disappeared. Daniel walked forward again, but paused beside Alicia. Just for 1 second. "I am sorry for what happened," he said quietly. Alicia did not respond with, "It is all right," because clearly it was not. She simply answered, her voice soft, but carrying the weight of metal. "You did the right thing." A passenger in row 13 leaned toward her. "I am an attorney. I saw everything. If you need a statement, I will provide one." Alicia handed him a business card. No logo, no title. Just a name and an email address. The man scanned it, frowned slightly, but did not ask questions. Something about that simplicity told him her position was not something that needed to be printed. Meanwhile, Melissa resumed meal service. At row 11, she lifted 2 chicken entrees, one for Harold, one for Linda. But when she turned to serve Alicia, she was pulled back abruptly. Mark reappeared like a shadow, snatching the meal tray from her hands. "We are out of chicken," he said, staring directly at Alicia. "That is not true." Melissa reacted before she could stop herself. "I just out." Mark snapped, crushing the carton in his hand. Alicia looked at him. No expression, but her silence was the kind of silence that made others feel small. The woman in row 13 stood up, her voice sharp as a blade. "I just watched you hand 2 chicken meals to row 11. Do not lie." Another passenger lifted a phone to record. A third voice rose. "He is discriminating. I will testify." The entire cabin transformed into a courtroom, and Mark was the defendant, standing exposed in the center of every glare. Melissa shook her head, her voice cracking. "Mark, please stop. You are making everything worse." She did not finish because a cold, authoritative voice sliced through the cabin like metal striking a steel table. "Mark Ellison." Sarah had returned, her arms folded, her eyes no longer angry. Now they resembled a verdict. "You have been relieved of duty. What you just did was a direct violation of the captain's order." She took 1 step closer. "Upon landing, you will be escorted off the aircraft. Your certification will be suspended pending investigation." Mark's mouth opened, but no sound came out. No excuses left to cling to, no one left to blame, no ground left to stand on. Sarah turned to Melissa. "Serve Ms. Grant her full meal." Then she turned to Alicia and again held her gaze longer than necessary, as if intuition was whispering something to her that logic had not yet caught up with. Alicia accepted the meal tray, not because she was hungry, but because this was the moment the truth began to shift entirely. No one in the cabin knew who she was. No one knew the investigation that was about to ignite. No one knew they were witnessing the opening chapter of a judgment that would reach far beyond this flight. But Alicia knew, and she sat upright silent, waiting for the moment when every mask would fall. The aircraft began its descent, the engines shifting rhythm, the cabin lights turning a soft amber to signal landing preparations. But inside the cabin, no one was thinking about the ground. Every gaze was fixed on Alicia, as if the entire flight sensed that the next moment would bend the story's trajectory entirely. Alicia sat upright, her hand resting on the black briefcase. Not anxious, not restless. She was calm in the most unsettling way, the calm of someone who had seen the ending long before anyone else realized the rules of the game had changed. When the wheels struck the runway, the cabin jolted hard. The air thickened to the density of fog. Harold swallowed. Linda gripped her armrest. Melissa bowed her head, exhaling shakily, as if praying for truth to be protected. Daniel stared toward the door, shoulders tense, like a man preparing to face an investigative board, and Mark was no longer breathing evenly. Each inhale hit his chest like a collision heavy enough to bruise. The feeling was familiar to him, like standing at the edge of a cliff without understanding how he had ended up with his heels hanging over it. The plane came to a full stop, but before passengers could unbuckle their seatbelts, Captain Sarah's voice came over the intercom, direct and unmasking. "All passengers, please remain seated. We must address a special situation before anyone is cleared to leave the aircraft." A ripple of shock swept across the cabin, but Alicia did not move. She simply lowered her eyelids, as if the moment she had anticipated since the back row had finally arrived. A door opened, not the cabin door. The forward door, the one reserved for crew and those with authority. Polished black shoes stepped onto the aisle floor. One person, then two, then three. Dark jackets, gold insignias. They required no introduction. The Enforcement Division of the Federal Aviation Administration. They never appeared for small complaints. They appeared when there were signs of systemic violations, when someone's actions were severe enough to place an entire airline under scrutiny. A female investigator stepped forward, posture-solid eyes, sharp as reinforced glass. Alicia knew her well. Diana Chen. Diana swept her gaze across the cabin. When her eyes paused on Alicia, it lasted only a fraction of a second, but enough for anyone perceptive to sense they were not strangers. Alicia remained expressionless, offering no greeting, no signal that would reveal the relationship to the cabin. Diana spoke in a formal, resonant tone. "We are looking for a passenger connected to a report of serious violations on this flight." The cabin held its breath. Alicia remained perfectly still. Daniel stepped forward as if to speak, but Diana raised her hand. "We have received a detailed file, including images, preliminary witness statements, and all relevant information." Sarah arrived from the cockpit, standing firmly. "I have reported the entire series of events. Safety violations, insubordination, and possible logbook tampering." Diana nodded. "We will be collecting physical evidence now." Then her gaze shifted toward the back of the cabin, to the galley where Mark Ellison was attempting to melt into the shadows. Mark Ellison. Not a question, a summons. Mark stepped out, unsteady. This is only a misunderstanding," Diana approached. "You are required to disembark for a federal investigation into safety violations, discriminatory conduct, and obstruction of passenger documentation." Mark shook his head violently. "Who reported this? Who dared file that report? That woman, who does she think she is?" Diana tilted her head slightly. A faint smile appeared, the kind someone gives when holding a truth the other person is completely blind to. "You genuinely do not know." Mark opened his mouth, but Diana did not wait for his answer. She turned toward Alicia. Every passenger followed her gaze, as if pulled by gravity itself. "Alicia Grant," Diana said loud and formal, no longer the volume of a cabin announcement, but the tone of a national declaration. "Thank you. We have received the full report from the Director of the Federal Aviation Administration." The cabin went silent, as though all air had been sucked out. Mark froze. Harold sank into his seat. Linda covered her mouth. Melissa nearly dropped the tray in her hands. Sarah looked at Alicia like she had just heard the true name of a legend. Alicia stood. Not dramatically, not triumphantly. She simply stood. Yet in that moment, the gravity of the entire cabin shifted. Every structure of authority Mark had tried to build during the flight disintegrated instantly. Alicia did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "You asked me who I am," she said, her tone low, precise, steady as steel. "This is your answer." Diana continued like reading charges in a courtroom. "You insulted displaced unlawfully and refused service to the individual who oversees the regulatory compliance of the entire aviation system of the United States." Mark staggered back. Then again. His spine hit the wall as if pushed by an invisible force. Alicia looked at him directly. Her eyes carried the authority to determine consequences, but they held no desire for revenge, only the weight of justice. "Now you understand why I documented everything she said, and why today will not end in silence." Diana placed a hand on Mark's shoulder. "Mr. Ellison, please step off the aircraft." The cabin erupted into whispers, then full waves of outrage, astonishment, respect, and release. But Alicia didn't look around. She simply sat back down, spine straight, eyes forward, silent, steady, unshaken. She knew that what happened today was not merely an incident. It was the beginning of an investigation that would shake the entire aviation sector. And this was only the beginning. Sarah escorted Alicia off the aircraft, but not through the passenger aisle. The service door opened instead, and the hot Washington air swept into the cabin like a wind stripping away the last dust from a buried truth. The FAA enforcement team walked ahead. Daniel and Melissa followed behind, and Alicia moved in the center, not as a victim, but as the axis around which the entire incident revolved. Outside, the blue and red lights of airport security vehicles flashed continuously, reflecting across the cockpit windows, like the opening scene of a major investigation. Passengers crowded near the door, watching Alicia pass, as if witnessing a figure stepping out of history, a history they had been unwillingly pulled into. No one spoke. No one looked away. Reporters were already waiting. Someone had leaked the story. Cameras turned toward Alicia like arrows of light, but she walked forward without flinching, without bowing her head. She was not someone caught in a scandal. She was the one who had revealed it. A journalist shouted, "Director Grant, is it true you were discriminated against in business class? Do you plan to file charges against the airline?" Alicia didn't answer, but her eyes, direct, sharp, and cold, answered for her. Inside a closed meeting room at the airport, the air hung thick as heavy fog. The FAA's preliminary report lay on the table, page after page of evidence photos, statements, torn log entries, and passenger videos capturing every word Mark said, every moment he abused his authority. Diana presented the findings. Her voice steady, but each sentence landed like a hammer. "We have evidence that the missing safety equipment was not a one-time incident. It has been ongoing for weeks, and the signs of logbook alteration are severe." Another inspector added, "Furthermore, relocating a passenger for non-operational reasons is a direct violation of the Air Carrier Anti-Discrimination Code." Every eye in the room shifted to Alicia. She sat motionless, but nothing about her stillness was passive. It was the stillness of someone who sets the agenda, not someone who follows it. Diana nodded respectfully. "We await your direction to begin the full-scale investigation." Alicia opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick document. No one knew when she had written it, but they all knew this much. She wrote it while sitting in seat. 41 Echo, the seat Mark believed would silence her. Her voice was low and steady, each word like a verdict delivered slowly but irrevocably. Initiate a full investigation, not only into this flight, into the entire system. Maintenance logs for the past 3 months, internal reports, passenger complaints, crew transfer rates, everything. One inspector hesitated. Director that will impact multiple departments, even disrupt operations. Alicia lifted her eyes. Any operation can pause. Safety cannot. The room fell silent. Everyone understood this was no longer about one flight attendant or one flight. This was a declaration of war on a culture of unchecked power in aviation. And Alicia was leading the charge. Melissa was called in. She stepped inside like someone walking on thin ice. Her eyes still red, her hands held rigidly at her sides. But when she saw Alicia, her shoulders dropped as if a weight had finally lifted. "Ms. Hart," Alicia said gently, "tell everything. Leave nothing out. Do not be afraid." Melissa began speaking. Her voice trembled at first, but then sentence by sentence it strengthened. She recounted the missing life vests, reporting it to Mark and being dismissed. The threat. "If you speak again, you lose your job." Being ordered not to serve row 38, watching Mark grab Evelyn's phone. When she finished, the room was silent. Alicia looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "You did the right thing, and the FAA will protect you." Melissa broke into tears, but not weak tears. They were tears of release, the sound of someone finally seen, finally believed, finally safe, after too many days of fear. Outside the meeting room, Mark Ellison sat alone, gripping his hands so tightly they had begun to bleed. He heard reporters saying his name. He heard doors opening and closing. He heard footsteps. He heard everything except salvation. He looked up when Alicia stepped out, and in his eyes was the deepest sort of fear. Fear of the silence held by someone who truly holds power. Alicia stopped in front of him. She did not lower herself to anger. She did not need to raise her voice. She spoke one sentence, simple but strong enough to collapse the last of his defenses. "You were not trying to harm me. You were trying to protect a system that was already rotten. And that is why you lost everything." Mark opened his mouth, wanting to apologize, to explain, to defend himself, but Alicia was already walking away, and he understood nothing he could say would save him. Not today. Not ever. When Alicia stepped into the arrivals hall, warm light spilled across the stone floor like the last rays of day. Reporters lined up. Flashes burst. Questions came in a rapid storm. But Alicia didn't stop. She turned her head slightly, just enough for the microphones to catch her words. Justice does not come from silence. It comes from action. And today is only the first step. Passengers on both sides applauded. Some touched her arm gently as she passed. An elderly woman whispered, "Thank you, dear." A boy tugged his mother's sleeve and murmured, "Mom, she looks like a superhero." Alicia did not smile, but her eyes softened, because she knew this battle was bigger than herself, and she was ready for the next chapter. 3 weeks later, the FAA's Grand Conference Hall was filled to capacity. The front rows were occupied by representatives of major airlines. Behind them sat reporters, cameras, government officials, and civil rights organizations. The cold white ceiling lights shone down like the illumination in an operating room, leaving no space for euphemisms, no space for excuses. Alicia stepped up to the podium. No music, no elegant introduction. Only the heavy, steady sound of her footsteps. Every conversation died the moment she placed her folder on the table. No one blinked. She looked directly at the room without smiling. "We have a problem," she said, her voice low and even, but weighted enough to echo off the four walls. And this problem did not begin on Flight 2847. It began with the habit of ignoring violations. It began with silence. It began the moment passengers were treated as inconveniences rather than human beings. No one moved. Airline executives straightened in their seats, as if leaning so much as a fraction could be interpreted as guilt. Alicia activated the screen behind her. The photos she had taken on the aircraft appeared missing life vests, broken exit lights, blocked emergency paths, torn logbooks. But she did not stop there. A new slide appeared, a rising graph cut through by a red line. 47,000 discrimination complaints in 5 years. Only 2% were seriously reviewed. One airline representative frowned, but Alicia continued, giving no opening for interruption. And that represents only the people who filed reports. The rest stayed silent because they believed no one would stand with them. She turned her gaze toward the airline directors. Silence is not a lack of data. Silence is evidence of fear. Melissa sat in the back, still as stone. Daniel folded his arms, chin lowered, as if guarding the truth, finally being brought into the light. Captain Sarah Coleman sat in the front row, eyes fixed on the stage. The atmosphere thickened with the realization that this was not a speech. It was a courtroom, and Alicia was the prosecutor. She shifted to the next slide, a list of airlines with red notations under each name. These violations were not accidents. They are the product of a culture that permits neglect, a culture that treats safety as optional, a culture that treats discrimination as a minor inconvenience. She paused for half a beat, then delivered the next sentence, slowly, heavily, like a hammer striking metal. And as of today, that culture ends. The room rippled as if struck by a sudden gust. A few people flinched. Others inhaled sharply, as if hearing a declaration of war. Alicia continued, "The FAA will launch a full-scale industry-wide investigation. Airlines will be subject to unannounced inspections. Any violation, no matter how small, will be penalized immediately. And this time, no one will be able to slip through the cracks." An airline director jumped to his feet. "Director Grant, these measures will cost hundreds of millions." Alicia cut him off without looking up. "Not more than a human life." The director went silent. Alicia turned her head slightly, a stare slicing through him like a laser through steel. "Either you do not understand your own industry, or you are unfit to lead it." The hall fell silent. It was not criticism. It was a verdict. Alicia placed more documents on the table, her tone unchanged. As of today, every airline must retrain all staff on anti-discrimination protocols. Mandatory, annual, independently audited. As of today, the FAA hotline will be open for passengers to report directly. As of today, additional flights will be equipped with cabin audio systems. Another airline representative protested, "That infringes on privacy." Alicia turned toward him, her voice cold enough to shake the entire row. Privacy cannot be used to conceal abuse of power. Melissa sat up straighter. Her eyes shone with absolute respect. Alicia pressed the final button. The screen shifted to the image of Mark being escorted off the aircraft. No one had expected it to appear. But silence dropped over the entire hall like a mourning veil. "This is not about one individual," Alicia said. "This is the consequence of a system unwilling to face itself, and we will change that." A reporter raised a hand. "Director Grant, many people consider you a hero. Do you have anything to say to them?" Alicia didn't smile. "No. I am not a hero. I am simply someone who refused to remain silent. The hall rose to its feet. Not a few people. Everyone. The applause thundered strong and relentless, like the drumbeat of a movement being born. Not applause for her. Applause for the truth, finally given voice. For a new chapter in aviation safety that Alicia Grant had forged from an experience meant to humble her. But she had not bowed. She had turned it into the force that lifted the entire industry higher. As Alicia stepped down from the stage, Melissa waited. "Director Grant, I still have my job because of you." Alicia placed a hand on her shoulder, her eyes softening for a rare moment. "No, Melissa. You have your job because you spoke the truth when others stayed silent." Daniel approached and nodded to Alicia, like a soldier saluting his commander. Sarah shook her hand, holding on longer than politeness required. Alicia looked at them, the people who had become proof that real change could begin with a single voice, a single photo, a single act of resistance inside a narrow cabin. Then Alicia walked out of the conference room. Not to conclude anything, but to begin the next phase of the fight. Because Alicia Grant knew well what she did today would not just change procedures. It would change people. And that is how a system is truly rebuilt. Not with regulations, but with courage. From the perspective of a specialist in systemic justice, Alicia Grant's journey shows that isolated acts of wrongdoing are never just individual incidents. They are symptoms of a structure long accustomed to surviving on bias and silence. Alicia's real strength does not lie in her title, but in her ability to turn a personal experience into momentum powerful enough to shift an entire industry. Every action she took, from documenting violations to confronting authority, reminds us that justice doesn't arrive on its own. It is built by those who choose to rise. If you believe truth deserves protection, like and subscribe to help spread that spirit. And leave a short comment with the phrase, "Stand up," to affirm that you choose to stand on the side of justice.